This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 691 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week wasn't so bad on this sleeper show. Khalil Shakir posted a top 20 performance as Buffalo's primary slot guy. Mike Boone was a top 30 running back. Deion Jackson was in the top 25. James Cook scored in garbage time. Those were some pretty decent hits, but it definitely was not perfect. Matt Collins did absolutely nothing on his 4 targets. Zay Jones did very little on his 8 targets. And Teddy Bridgewater, the only quarterback streamer that actually played, left his Week 5 game early. Overall, could have definitely been worse. We've had way worse weeks than that. There were some good picks in there. So let's keep it going into Week 6. Before getting to this week's sleepers, I want to remind you that Twisted Tea and FanDuel have joined forces to bring you a one-of-a-kind contest series that gives you a chance to compete for your share of thousands of dollars in site credit. Introducing Twisted Tea's College Football Picks, a sports betting-focused contest series that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. Each college football game will be assigned money line, spread, and total markets with assigned points to each market. All you have to do is make 6 selections based on those 3 markets and earn points for each correct selection you made. If at the end of the day your score ranks among the best in the contest, you'll be eligible for your share of site credit. Head over to FanDuel.com/TwistedTeaPicks and make your picks. And remember, please drink responsibly. I switched up the format of the show last week, so if you missed last week's show, here's a quick breakdown of the changes. Instead of looking at 3 tiers or buckets of sleepers, we're looking at just 2 now. We'll look at players you might be able to start this week who are rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and then the second bucket consists of deeper sleepers, guys rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues. We'll kick things off as we always do, and that's with a quarterback streamer. Daniel Jones, Danny Dimes. I feel like Daniel Jones is not getting enough credit for what he's done so far this year. He's playing with legitimately terrible weapons given all the injuries that they've dealt with. And he's still a mid-range QB2 in fantasy football. And obviously the Giants are winning too. But Jones has scored at least 12 fantasy points in every outing with those weapons. That doesn't sound like much, but given the circumstances, that's not bad. Especially when you consider he has just 3 passing touchdowns on the season. You at least know going into a given game that he's going to provide something because of his rushing. He's averaging 46 yards per game on the ground this year. That equates to over a passing touchdown in fantasy scoring. And I mentioned the fact that he has just 3 passing touchdowns. That's another thing to point out here. The Giants have scored 10 touchdowns this year. 7 of them have been on the ground. That 3 to 7 pass to rush touchdown ratio is the second lowest in football, behind only Philadelphia. The lowest ratio since 2011 has been 0.59. So we're looking at some possible regression in how the Giants are scoring touchdowns. And this week, Jones gets Baltimore, a team that ranks as the 6th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. He's a pretty decent streaming option. I'd still play Geno Smith over him, but Geno's percent rostered number shot up this past week. At wide receiver, we're going to go back to the Bills slot guys. If Isaiah McKenzie goes this week, I think he's a very strong play in a game that has the highest over-under on the slate. Remember, when Jamison Crowder was healthy, McKenzie wasn't the full-time slot guy for the Bills. Crowder's now out, and while they may throw Khalil Shakir in there a little bit, McKenzie's likely to be the primary slot guy when he's healthy. And that's a big deal in one of the most attractive passing offenses in football. Kansas City's also allowed the 11th most slot yards this year, according to PFF. And for those of you with Shakir, I have Shakir in plenty of leagues too, I wouldn't drop him if McKenzie's trending up. We don't know for sure how this position is going to be split, and Shakir's a very good football player. So hold on to him just in case. I'm just projecting McKenzie to see more work at this point. In his last 2 contests, he's hit target shares of 16% and 18%. And that was with more competition. Now, in that same game between the Chiefs and Bills is Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He hasn't had a monster game yet, and maybe it won't come this year, but he was wide receiver 20 last week after seeing a 19% target share. He's now averaged a target share per game of 19% since week 1. He's also run the most routes for Kansas City this year. That can go a long way in a Patrick Mahomes-led offense, especially in a potential shootout. Zay Jones is probably going to be a staple for the show because he's seeing enough work in his offense, and chances are he's just never going to rise above that 50% threshold. But Jones is coming off a wide receiver 81 performance. His percent roster number definitely did not jump after last week. The good news, though, is that he still saw an 18% target share for Jacksonville last week. That's a number that he's now hit in 3 of 4 games played. The Colts are not the best matchup, and they held Zay the last time these two teams played. But he can work as a higher floor bye-week filler in PPR formats. I don't like him as much as the other wide receivers that I'm going to talk about on the show today, but an 18% target share should be called out on a show like this. A player I definitely like more than Jones this week is Rondale Moore. Arizona's facing Seattle this week. Seattle's been decent against wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've been really, really bad against the rush. But they've allowed the 4th most slot yards this year, and that's where Moore is likely to line up. Arizona's slot guys have seen a lot of work this season. Greg Dortch was the primary slot receiver before Rondale Moore came back, and he saw 9, 4, and 10 targets in the 3 games where he was the starter. This past week, Rondale Moore had a 21% target share. This game against Seattle has the 2nd highest total on this week's slate. I think Moore is a nice high floor option, especially in PPR formats. And then Alec Pierce is the last wide receiver to bring up in this tier. I talked about him also on the 15 Transaction Show this week, but to reiterate some of those points, he's still playing behind Paris Campbell technically, but he saw a 25% target share this past week. And he's looked really good. He's a freak athlete capable of making big plays. We just need Matt Ryan to throw the ball down the field a little bit more. That hasn't happened that much this year. But I'm expecting Pierce to build off his performance and morph into the Colts' unquestioned wide receiver too. It's definitely not a great matchup this week with the Jags ranking as the 4th best matchup against wideouts and adjusted fantasy points allowed, but there's not a lot to choose from off the waiver wire. He at least has a chance to see a decent amount of work. Now let's shift our focus to running backs. Eno Benjamin still hasn't crossed that 50% rostered threshold, despite the injuries all over that Cardinals backfield. At the time of this recording, I'm not sure who's in or who's out, but chances are Eno's going to have a role this weekend. And it's a role against the league's 3rd worst defense against running backs and adjusted points allowed. The Seahawks have also allowed the most rushing yards in the league. It's the perfect spot for Benjamin. He might not see all of Arizona's rushing production, but he can be effective as a receiver too. He's now hit a double-digit percentage target share in 2 games this year in a part-time role. Rachaad White is also in play this week. As I talked about in the 10 Trends episode, White's at that 40% snap share mark, and now the Buccaneers get a matchup against Pittsburgh. Now, Steelers fans, you might want to cover your ears, but the Steelers may be the worst team in football right now. Pittsburgh's sort of been a pass funnel to start the season. They rank as the best matchup in football for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed, while being below average for running backs. But if Tampa Bay gets a lead in this one, don't be surprised to see a good bit of Rachaad White. It's a tough week with buys, so he's firmly in RB3 territory for me this week. Another thing I've been talking about is the Chiefs' backfield share. Clyde Edwards-Helaire has now outsnapped Jerick McKinnon in just 1 game this year. Last week, CEH saw just 1 more carry and 1 more target than Jerick McKinnon. The only game where their rush attempts were dramatically different was Week 4 against Tampa Bay. As I've been saying, the Bills-Chiefs game could be a shootout. McKinnon is likely to play a little bit in that game, so he's cheap exposure to it. According to my rankings and tiers, he's in that RB4 range this week. And then lastly in this tier, Mike Boone. We'll see how Latavius Murray gets deployed in this backfield in Week 6, but Boone handled over 30% of Denver's running back rushes to go along with an 8% target share last week. He's now averaged over a 10% target share per game over his last 2. Now maybe things get really, really messy with Latavius Murray. It's very, very possible. But Boone's been pretty good. He's gained 58 rushing yards on 10 rush attempts over their last 2, and last week alone, he put together an 85-yard performance on 10 total touches. He's definitely a risky play, but he does make some sense against the Chargers, who rank as the 5th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. I've got 5 super deep plays for you this week who I definitely hope you don't have to rely on, but you never know. The first is DJ Dallas. Rashad Penny being out for the year means that this is now Kenneth Walker's backfield. I talked about that at length on Tuesday's 15 Transactions episode. But don't be surprised if DJ Dallas gets some run too. Walker should see more work as a receiver than Rashad Penny saw, or at least we shouldn't count that out. But Dallas could very easily be deployed as the team's pass catching back. We saw them do that with Travis Homer earlier this season. The Seahawks get the Cardinals this week, and like I said, this game has a pretty high over-under, the 2nd best on the slate. So DJ Dallas makes some sense if you play into that backfield ambiguity. And there's also Pierre Strong. It's a pretty similar situation for Strong as it is DJ Dallas, where there's a running back injury, allowing a third stringer to potentially be a second stringer. Damian Harris is out for New England, and I'm well prepared for Ramondre Stevens season. I also recognize that a player like Strong could just end up getting more run than expected. We're not flawless with our projections. Now, he's been dressed, but he's barely playing for the Patriots. He hasn't played that much with Damian Harris being healthy. But I'm calling him out as a pure dart throw right now. They get Cleveland, and Cleveland has been bad against running backs in fantasy this year. They've been a top 5 opponent. You absolutely need to have Ramondre Stevenson in your lineup, but don't totally sleep on Pierre Strong. Randall Cobb had a huge day in week 5. He had 13 targets and a 33% target share. We cannot expect that each week. We shouldn't expect that each week. And we have to recognize that he's still not playing in 2 wide receiver sets for Green Bay. He has played 82% of his snaps from the slot, though, and the Jets rank first in the NFL in percentage of targets allowed to the slot this year. I do think Cobb's ceiling is just generally limited, and we can't assume the Packers are going to throw a ton in this game. But the matchup is at least there this week to exploit. And then I'm a little bit intrigued by Darius Slayton this week too. At the time of this recording, it sounds like there's a chance that Wan'Dale Robinson could be back this week. So keep an eye on that. I mean, keep an eye on the whole Giants pass catcher situation. But even though Slayton didn't lead the team in routes run this past week, he looked good. He saw a 27% target share. Maybe that earns him a little bit more time. And now he's facing Baltimore, a team that ranks as the 11th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And then lastly, at tight end, Cameron Brate right now at the time of this recording, he's still in concussion protocol. That means that Cade Otton is in play. In week 5, Otton caught 6 of 7 targets for 43 yards. He ran 49 routes and he had a 14% target share. He was their tight end 1. It was just him. There's nothing scary about this matchup against the Steelers. And if Brate misses this game, Otton is a nice streamer. Now for our streaming defenses, usually the streaming defenses do pretty well, but last week, not so great. So let's get back on track. This week, I like Washington, as I pointed out on the 15 Transaction Show, and you could even go with Chicago, who they're facing, because that game on Thursday night could be a slop fest. I think Cincinnati's in play too. They get New Orleans. The Saints have been the 3rd best matchup for opposing defenses this year, and I think regardless of who's under center, Cincinnati works. And then Indianapolis is the last streaming defense against Jacksonville. The Jags are an average opponent who's been struggling on offense the last couple of weeks. Indianapolis is at home. They're 2.5 point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And there's a low 41.5 point over-under. So you could go in the Colts direction too. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com, join the Patreon, subscribe to the newsletter, do all that fun stuff. As always, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it. I will talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.